Have you ever noticed that the moment you stop chasing someone, they suddenly notice your absence? There's a reason for this. It's not just coincidence, it's a divine shift. In relationships, especially those stuck in anxious-avoidant dynamics, one person often carries the emotional labor, constantly giving, seeking validation, and managing the other's distance. But when they finally choose themselves, when they walk away, the tables turn in ways that can feel almost karmic. This isn't about playing games or seeking revenge. It's about recognizing your worth, honoring your boundaries, and trusting that the universe is orchestrating a powerful removal that triggers awakening, reflection, and growth. Today, we're diving into why leaving the avoidant isn't just an act of courage, it's a divine movement that changes everything. There's something almost magical that happens when you start paying attention to timing in your life. Often, we think relationships are all about effort, about who tries harder, who communicates better, or who gives more. And yes, effort matters, but there's an invisible force that many people overlook: the timing of events, the timing of choices, and the timing of departures. You see, walking away from someone at the right time isn't about rejection or punishment. It's about alignment. It's about stepping into your own life at the exact moment you're meant to, creating a ripple effect that changes everything around you. When you continue to give to someone who is emotionally unavailable or avoidant, it can feel like you're spinning your wheels, constantly hoping for a change that may never come. But the moment you choose yourself, the moment you stop trying to fix, control, or chase, you trigger a shift that's beyond your control. This is what I call divine timing. It's that almost unexplainable, cosmic coordination where the universe positions you exactly where you need to be, not just for your own growth, but for theirs as well. Many people underestimate the impact of walking away at the right time. It's not just a personal act, it's a signal, a message to the universe and to the other person that the dynamic has changed. Suddenly, what once felt like stability, their control over the relationship, their comfort with your presence is disrupted. And for someone who is avoidant, this disruption can be shocking because their emotional armor is built on the assumption that you'll always be there, waiting, giving, accommodating. When you step back, you're not just leaving a space physically, you're removing the emotional scaffolding that kept their avoidance functional. This absence, this deliberate pause, creates an environment where they have no choice but to face reality. They see what they took for granted, they feel what they lost, and they are forced to reckon with a world where they can't dictate the emotional narrative anymore. Timing in this context isn't accidental. There's a natural rhythm to relationships, and when you honor it, you allow both parties to grow. Your walk away is not a reaction driven by anger or hurt. It's a conscious act guided by self-awareness and inner alignment. It says, I will not compromise my peace, my boundaries, or my emotional well-being for someone who is unwilling to meet me halfway. And here's the most interesting part. When you step into your own timing, when you choose yourself first, the avoidant experiences a kind of awakening they never expected. They begin to feel the absence as a reflection of what they failed to provide. And this, in turn, can spark a transformation that words or pleading could never achieve, to truly grasp what happens when the anxious walks away and the avoidant is left to face reality. You first need to understand the dynamics at play. In many relationships, patterns form almost unconsciously. One person, often called the anxious type, tends to seek closeness, reassurance, and validation. They invest deeply, sometimes giving more than they receive, constantly tuning into the emotional state of their partner. They care intensely, and this intensity can feel like both a gift and a burden. The other person, the avoidant type, tends to fear being smothered or losing their independence. They may have a pattern of pulling away, distancing themselves emotionally, or avoiding commitment because closeness triggers anxiety or discomfort for them. These two personalities can create a push-pull dynamic that feels intense, confusing, and sometimes exhausting. The anxious invests their energy in hope and connection, and the avoidant thrives in a space where distance is comfortable, where emotions are manageable, and where they feel free from pressure. Over time, the anxious may find themselves bending over backward, constantly adjusting their behavior to soothe or accommodate the avoidant's distance. They might apologize more than necessary, anticipate needs that aren't expressed, and compromise their own boundaries in an attempt to preserve the relationship. Meanwhile, the avoidant often doesn't even realize the extent to which they rely on the anxious for emotional labor. They become accustomed to the push-pull rhythm and may even believe it's normal, mistaking emotional dependence for love or stability. What's fascinating, though, is how these roles create a cycle that feels almost impossible to break. The anxious becomes more anxious because their needs are unmet, and the avoidant retreats further, often unaware of the impact of their withdrawal. This creates a feedback loop. The more the anxious seeks reassurance, the more the avoidant distances themselves, which in turn fuels the anxious's insecurities. And while this might feel like a dead end, it also sets the stage for transformation. The moment the anxious decides to step back, to honor their own boundaries, and to stop compensating for the avoidance, everything changes. This decision interrupts the cycle, creating a disruption that forces the avoidant to confront emotions and realities they've been avoiding. It's in this interruption that growth, self-awareness, and reflection can finally emerge. There comes a moment in every relationship where the anxious partner realizes that their energy, their love, and their devotion are not being met with the same intention. It's that quiet, yet unmistakable moment when you look at the dynamic, feel the imbalance, and recognize that continuing to chase or compromise your peace only prolongs the inevitable. Walking away in that moment is not a sign of weakness or immaturity. It's a demonstration of self-respect, clarity, and the courage to prioritize your own emotional health. It's when you stop giving to someone who has repeatedly chosen distance over connection and instead choose yourself that the true shift begins. And for the avoidant, this can feel like a sudden earthquake because their comfort, their control, and their emotional distance have been maintained for so long by the presence of the anxious. When the anxious walks away, the avoidant is confronted with a reality they've likely never faced before, the absence of the very person who has been holding space for their avoidance. This absence is not just physical, it is emotional, psychological, and often entirely unexpected. For someone who has relied on the anxious for validation, consistency, and care, the withdrawal creates a void that cannot be ignored. Suddenly, they can no longer take for granted the patience, the flexibility, or the emotional labor they've relied on for so long. Every comfort they assumed was permanent now feels fragile, and every choice they made to avoid intimacy now echoes with consequences. Walking away is more than just leaving, it's a statement, a declaration, and a strategic move that disrupts a long-standing pattern. It forces the avoidant to finally reckon with the reality that their distance has limits, that their independence does not negate responsibility, and that the person they assumed would always tolerate or accommodate them has their own life, their own boundaries, and their own standards. And here's the nuance that many people miss: the timing of the walkaway is crucial. It's not about leaving impulsively in anger or frustration, but about choosing the exact moment when stepping back creates clarity, reflection, and an opportunity for growth. The avoidant is jolted out of their comfort zone not by confrontation, criticism, or ultimatum, but by the quiet, powerful act of absence. One of the most exhausting patterns in relationships is the push and pull between an anxious partner and an avoidant one. The anxious gives, reaches out, and seeks reassurance, while the avoidant retreats, distances themselves, and avoids emotional depth. Over time, this cycle can feel like a treadmill. You're moving, exerting effort, and hoping for progress, yet somehow you remain in the same place. The moment the anxious chooses to stop participating in this cycle, to stop chasing, pleading, or compromising their boundaries for someone who consistently withdraws, everything begins to shift. This is the moment the avoidant starts experiencing the consequences of their behavior in a way they rarely have before. They are forced to confront the fact that their distance and avoidance can no longer be sustained by someone else's relentless pursuit. Breaking the cycle is not just an act of self-preservation, it's an act of clarity. It allows the avoidant to experience the relationship differently, not through control or escape, but through absence. Suddenly, there is no one to chase, no one to accommodate, and no one to smooth over the uncomfortable feelings they've been avoiding. This absence exposes the reality of what they've lost: the emotional safety net, the patience, and the unwavering attention that the anxious provided. And here's the thing: avoidants often don't notice or feel the consequences of their actions until that safety net disappears. It's in this vacuum that they start to reflect, question, and experience a sense of urgency that was never present before. This is why breaking the cycle is so powerful. It disrupts the rhythm that allowed avoidance to thrive, forcing the avoidant to confront emotions they have suppressed, patterns they have normalized, and the real impact of their choices. It's not about manipulation or punishment, it's about creating space where both parties can finally see themselves and the relationship clearly. For the anxious, stepping back provides freedom, peace, and a chance to reclaim energy that was being drained. For the avoidant, the absence creates a mirror that shows them what has been taken for granted, what has been neglected, and what has been lost. And this reflection often triggers something profound: a realization that connection, intimacy, and emotional investment are not unlimited resources. One of the most powerful shifts that happens when the anxious walks away is the recognition of personal worth. So often, people in anxious-avoidant dynamics underestimate themselves, thinking their love, attention, and patience are just part of being in a relationship. They apologize for needing reassurance, they compromise for the sake of peace, and they tolerate patterns that drain them emotionally. But the moment you truly recognize that your value is non-negotiable, everything changes. This isn't arrogance or pride, it's clarity. It's understanding that your energy, your time, and your emotional well-being are precious resources that should never be casually spent on someone who consistently fails to meet you in return. When you operate from this place of self-respect, the dynamics that once defined the relationship no longer hold power over you. Walking away from someone who does not honor your value is an act of empowerment. It communicates a simple but profound message: I will not settle for less than I deserve. I will not compromise my peace, and I will not be held hostage by fear or emotional manipulation. And here's the interesting thing: the avoidant may not initially see or understand this. Their world, built on the assumption that you would always be there, suddenly feels unstable. The patterns they relied upon to maintain emotional distance are disrupted because your value sets the boundary that they cannot cross. This boundary is not about punishment, it is about protection. It's about refusing to allow someone else's avoidance or inconsistency to dictate your self-worth or your choices. When you step into this level of self-awareness, something remarkable happens. You begin to attract relationships and interactions that reflect your standard. You stop giving to those who do not reciprocate, and you start prioritizing those who meet you halfway, emotionally and energetically. Meanwhile, for the avoidant, witnessing this shift can be startling. They begin to experience the tangible consequences of their detachment and the vacuum left by your absence. The very person who once filled the gaps they ignored is now choosing themselves, and the stability they took for granted is gone. This is a powerful moment because it forces reflection, a confrontation with what they missed, what they undervalued, and the reality that your love, patience, and presence are not unlimited. When the anxious finally steps back, the avoidant is forced to face something they rarely encounter: the weight of their own absence and avoidance. For so long, they have relied on the other person to hold space for their fears, to soothe the emotional gaps, and to tolerate patterns of distancing that might otherwise cause tension. But when that presence is removed, the avoidant can no longer escape the reality of what has been happening in the relationship. There's a subtle but powerful shift that takes place. Suddenly, they are alone with their choices, and the consequences become undeniable. They may feel confusion, frustration, or even panic because the safety net they assumed would always be there is no longer holding them up. This moment exposes the truth of what avoidance really costs. Avoidants often think distance protects them, but in reality, it delays confrontation with their emotions. The anxious partner, by consistently stepping in to reassure, accommodate, or manage their partner's discomfort, has been acting as a buffer against their own reflection. The walkaway removes that buffer, and now they must contend with feelings they've long suppressed: regret, longing, and the realization that they cannot manipulate or avoid the situation anymore. They start to notice the subtle ways in which their choices have affected the other person, and, for the first time, they feel the absence of emotional labor they once took for granted. The consequences aren't just emotional, they often affect behavior too. The avoidant may attempt to reach out, reconsider priorities, or reevaluate patterns of detachment, but this is often the first authentic moment of introspection they've had in the relationship. The anxious stepping back creates a mirror, one that reflects not only loss but the opportunity for growth. Avoidants are confronted with the idea that they cannot keep avoiding intimacy without risking the permanent departure of someone who truly cares. This confrontation is uncomfortable because it challenges the foundation they built their emotional safety upon. For years, avoidance may have felt safe, but now absence reveals vulnerability. And with vulnerability comes a chance for genuine transformation. Self-respect is one of the most powerful tools you can bring into a relationship, and yet it's often underestimated, especially in dynamics where one person is anxious and the other avoidant. Many people think love means constantly giving, adjusting, or tolerating behaviors that make them uncomfortable. They believe that compromising their boundaries is a demonstration of care, or that sacrificing their own needs is proof of devotion. But self-respect flips this thinking entirely. It is the understanding that your needs, your boundaries, and your peace are not optional, they are essential. When you embrace self-respect, you stop negotiating your worth and start showing the other person, through actions more than words, that you will not settle for less than what you deserve. This is particularly transformative in relationships with avoidance because they have often relied on a lack of boundaries to maintain control and distance. When you enforce self-respect, the avoidant is confronted with a reality they are not accustomed to. They are used to being able to maintain their space, to pull away, and to dictate the pace of emotional connection. But self-respect interrupts this rhythm. By honoring your own boundaries, by refusing to chase or appease, you create a structure where they can no longer manipulate comfort or avoidance. Suddenly, they are faced with the need to consider your perspective, your feelings, and your value, all in ways they were able to ignore before. This is not about punishment, it's about creating balance. The presence of self-respect communicates that the relationship is no longer one-sided, that your energy cannot be taken for granted, and that intimacy comes with accountability. Self-respect also transforms your internal landscape. You begin to act from a place of confidence, not fear. You stop worrying about reactions, chasing validation, or carrying the emotional weight of someone else's avoidance. You start making decisions based on what is healthy and sustainable for you, rather than what you think might temporarily soothe the other person. And for the avoidant, this shift is often shocking. They realize that the dynamic they depended on, where your emotions, patience, and care could be taken for granted, no longer exists. This is when their so-called comfort zone begins to crumble, replaced by reflection, awareness, and sometimes panic. Your self-respect forces them to confront a truth they've long avoided. Relationships are reciprocal, emotional labor is not endless, and if they want to maintain connection, they must rise to meet it. One of the most misunderstood concepts in relationships is the idea of divine removal. The moment when someone who has been carrying the emotional weight chooses to step back and walk away. At first, it may feel like loss or failure, like the universe has abandoned you, but in reality, it is often the most powerful form of protection and growth. Divine removal is not about revenge or punishment, it is about creating space for clarity, healing, and realignment. When the anxious walks away from an avoidant partner, it triggers a shift that neither party could have manufactured through confrontation or argument. It is an act that allows the anxious to reclaim their energy, honor their boundaries, and step into a life that reflects their worth, while simultaneously forcing the avoidant to face the reality of their choices and behaviors. This type of removal works in a way that subtlety and strategy cannot. The avoidant, accustomed to distance and control, suddenly finds themselves without the very person who absorbed the emotional labor and consistently accommodated their withdrawal. They are confronted with absence in a way that is unavoidable, undeniable, and deeply reflective. For the anxious, walking away is liberating. It is the conscious decision to prioritize self-love over approval, peace over uncertainty, and growth over stagnation. And for the avoidant, it becomes a catalyst for self-reflection, accountability, and sometimes awakening, because it is only in the absence of someone they took for granted that they feel the real impact of their avoidance. Divine removal also teaches a powerful lesson about the nature of attachment and control. It reminds us that love cannot be forced, emotional labor cannot be one-sided indefinitely, and growth often requires separation. By stepping back, the anxious allows the avoidant to see, for perhaps the first time, the consequences of neglect, the reality of lost opportunities, and the emotional depth they may have been avoiding. This absence acts like a mirror, reflecting not anger or blame, but truth, clarity, and the consequences of repeated patterns. In many ways, this removal is a blessing because it forces both parties to reassess, rethink, and, if possible, realign in a way that fosters mutual respect, awareness, and healthier emotional connection. One of the most transformative moments in any relationship is when you begin to recognize that your emotional freedom does not depend on someone else's choices, presence, or approval. For the anxious partner, so much of life can feel tethered to another person's moods, reactions, or distance. There's a constant push to chase, to soothe, to anticipate, and to give in hopes of creating connection where it may not naturally exist. But the moment you step back, the moment you consciously decide to prioritize your own well-being, you begin to reclaim a sense of autonomy that is both empowering and necessary. Emotional freedom doesn't mean shutting your heart off. It means understanding that your peace, your value, and your growth are independent of someone else's availability or willingness to meet you halfway. When you embrace emotional freedom, the avoidant is immediately affected in ways they may not have anticipated. They are used to a dynamic where their distance is cushioned by your presence, your patience, and your constant reassurance. When you reclaim your emotional energy, that cushion disappears, and suddenly they are confronted with a reality where the relationship cannot be maintained without genuine effort, reciprocity, or awareness on their part. This is not punishment, it is clarity. It is the universe, the natural order, or simply the logical consequence of boundaries being respected and self-worth being prioritized. The avoidant now feels the absence of emotional labor, and this often triggers a deeper understanding of what their avoidance has cost them, not through words, arguments, or ultimatums, but through the undeniable reality of presence versus absence. Emotional freedom also teaches the anxious partner an invaluable lesson that love is not about sacrificing yourself endlessly for someone who cannot or will not meet you fully. It is about honoring your own heart, protecting your peace, and allowing space for relationships to exist in balance rather than imbalance. By stepping into this freedom, you create a new dynamic, one where you are no longer defined by your attachment style or your willingness to chase. Instead, you define yourself through clarity, confidence, and intentionality. For the avoidant, this freedom can feel like a shock because the pattern they relied upon for comfort and control has been dismantled. The absence of constant accommodation forces reflection, confrontation, and often an awakening to the reality that connection and intimacy require conscious presence, not passive tolerance. At the heart of every relationship, there is a rhythm, a push and a pull, a giving and a receiving, a closeness and a distance. In anxious-avoidant dynamics, this rhythm often becomes a pattern that leaves one person giving endlessly and the other retreating comfortably. But when the anxious finally chooses themselves, when they honor their boundaries, step back, and reclaim their energy, something remarkable happens. The avoidant, who has grown accustomed to distance and control, is forced to face the reality of what has been taken for granted. This isn't about punishment or revenge, it's about clarity, growth, and alignment. Walking away is an act of courage, self-respect, and divine timing. It signals to the universe and to the other person that your peace, your worth, and your emotional well-being are non-negotiable. It disrupts unhealthy patterns, breaks the cycle of chasing and withdrawal, and creates the space needed for both parties to reflect and grow. For the anxious, this moment brings liberation, freedom, and the ability to finally prioritize themselves without guilt. For the avoidant, it is a wake-up call, a mirror that reflects their avoidance, their choices, and the reality of the connection they risked losing. Ultimately, divine removal is a blessing disguised as absence. It teaches lessons that words cannot. It transforms relationships by revealing truth, and it ensures that love and connection are built on mutual respect rather than dependence. When you step into this space, when you honor yourself and your boundaries, you invite a shift that changes everything. You reclaim your power, create healthier dynamics, and allow both yourself and the other person to evolve in ways that were impossible while the old patterns persisted. It is in this space, the space of courage, clarity, and self-respect, that true growth happens, and both hearts have the opportunity to realign, reflect, and ultimately step into a life that reflects their highest value, their deepest potential, and the love they truly deserve.